Good morning, Bear Nation. This is Bear with BearIndependent.com with a lip full of sunflower seeds. Cracked pepper, baby. It should just be called crack. I wanted to just riff quickly on the concept of the New Green Deal, which is not great, says me. But basically the cornerstone of that plan, or one of the cornerstones of that plan, is to convert the United States entirely to wind and solar over the course of a decade. As somebody who's installed a lot of wind and a good bit of solar, I just wanted to talk about that for a moment. The issue is that the wind and solar is being implemented to reduce emissions. The problem with that, and one of the reasons why I am no longer in the wind industry after about a decade as a project manager and a consultant, both designing and constructing large utility scale projects all around the United States of America, is that while yes, when that turbine is spinning, it's not producing any carbon emissions, nobody looks at the manufacturing emissions. Nobody. The service life of the average turbine in the United States is 20 years. Maybe 25. But on average 20. After 20 years, they do a reman, meaning that they will pull the nacelle, the box on top of the tower with the blades attached, which by the way are called rotors. They'll pull the nacelle and they'll put new rotor blades up and a new generator in the nacelle, stick it back on top of the existing tower, and use the existing subsurface infrastructure, the wiring, the power cables that run from that turbine back to, through a collection system, back to a substation, then will run overland in a transmission line from where the power is produced, i.e. the wind farm, to the market where it is consumed. Your neighborhood, your region, your state, whatever. So you get, with that reman, about 40 years on the infrastructure. Total utilization of the infrastructure. And the reman costs about 40% of the initial construction cost, which by the way is still billions of dollars. But the offset, carbon wise, it takes 38 years for that turbine to run, generally speaking, in the 1.5 to 2.4 megawatt range. 38 years for that turbine to spin in order to make up for the amount of carbon that was produced to manufacture it. That's the turbine, the tower, and the rotor blades. 38 years. Remember, we get 40 years out of existing infrastructure in a reman. That does not take into account all the diesel fuel that was burnt to truck all those pieces in, all the diesel fuel that was burnt to dig those foundations, to dig those trenches, to run the trucks full of men and women who are driving overland, putting these projects up, to transport all of the material, all of the copper and aluminum, literal tons upon tons upon tons of it that is smelted. 1 ton of copper produces somewhere in the range of 5.5 tons of CO2 emissions to smelt. And aluminum is worse, almost twice as worse. I think it's 10.4 tons of carbon emissions per 1 ton of aluminum smelted. Those are your conductors that run underneath the ground and overland on structures to move that power hundreds of miles of cabling to just collect all the different turbines into what are called circuits back to the substation, and then move that power overland from the project to the market. Hundreds of tons, thousands of tons of copper and aluminum required just for that portion. Then we get into concrete. The cooking of lime into cement is one of the most egregious ways that we pollute. Lots of carbon emission there. Underneath the average 2.4 megawatt turbine, there's 660 cubic yards or 66 truckloads of concrete, 75-ish tons of reinforcing steel, 2.5 semi-loads and 66 concrete trucks just to get the foundation in. The long and short is, when it's all said and done, it's a net loss in efficiency for scrubbing carbon by the use of wind turbines currently. Now, maybe future technology will be able to expand upon this, but current technology cannot. I want you to understand this. In the United States of America, the big three producers and builders of wind power are all through certain shell corporations, and it's funny I say shell, through certain shell corporations, are all oil companies. It's diversification. It's the same thing that when cigarette companies were being sued for causing cancer a couple decades ago. It's not that they didn't know that their product caused cancer. That's not why they fought it in court. They fought it so that they could buy themselves time to diversify into other industries so that they wouldn't suffer a huge impact to their bottom line. The oil companies are doing the same thing with renewable energy. And whether you believe in the concept of peak oil or not, this is what's happening in the renewable energy sector. And so don't be amazed when you see a whole bunch of politicians screaming that we need to subsidize renewable energy. The companies that own these renewable energy companies are British Petroleum, are ExxonMobil, they are Dutch Shell. They're the same companies, playing the same games. They're just wearing a different uniform with a slightly different technology. Okay? So understand that. And then also understand that currently, wind and solar are secondary generation only. They cannot currently be, they don't scale well. Meaning that fossil fuels and nuclear, we generate power with them because they generate heat. We use that heat to make steam. We use that steam to turn turbines. If I need a little bit more power, I open the valve a little bit, which gives me a little bit more steam, which turns the turbine a little bit more, which makes a little bit more power. It's much more difficult to scale incrementally using a bunch of turbines. Okay, so because my lowest common denominator is 1.5 megawatts, or 2.4 megawatts, or 3.3 megawatts. That's part of the challenge. So if I bring one turbine online, all I need is 1 megawatt, but that turbine pushes 1.5 megawatts. Now I've got an excess of a half a megawatt. What do I do with it? That's part of it. And I'm oversimplifying all of this, by the way, because I want it to be accessible, but yet poignant. So that's part of the problem. The other problem is the reason right now that these technologies are secondary generation and we use fossil fuel and nuclear as primary generation is because fossil fuel and nuclear, because they're so scalable, allow us to generate power on demand. Wind and solar do not allow us to generate power on demand. And we do not have the capacitor technology, i.e. batteries, currently, that have the capability to store the amount of electricity that these projects, utility scale wind and solar, will produce, and then use it on demand when it's needed. We are not there yet. Now, that does not mean that we should not continue to work on our capacitor technology. We should, but not with a legislative gun barrel to our heads, for sure. So wind and solar right now, they've come leaps and bounds over the last several decades. Leaps and bounds. But they are not primary generation. There is not a way currently in the United States of America to use them as primary generation. So the fact that they would even be considered for primary generation by a bunch of political pundits just shows their idiocy. I was going to say Idiocracy, which is a great movie. Just shows their idiocy and their misunderstanding of the situation. And then also, just so that you are aware, the concept that we are going to use these devices so that we eliminate carbon emissions is deeply flawed. Deeply flawed. We produce so much carbon in the manufacturing and implementation of these systems that these systems cannot make up for it. And so until we figure out that portion of the equation, we're literally throwing good after bad. We're making twice as much carbon as we'll ever remove by even implementing the system. So, that's one man's opinion on one small scope of the New Green Deal. Shalom and blessings.